Hi, welcome to Life, Love, Insight, Fertility Experiences. I'm here today with Justine Witzke, and it is so interesting, the work that she's doing. It's fascinating to me, actually. She's doing a lot of work with known donors, and it's something that we don't really talk about today. So she's here to share all of her wealth of information and knowledge. And so thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. And I, as you might imagine, could talk about this forever. So I will try to make it information that's digestible and useful to people. I think, it needs to be practical. And there are so many different, as we were just talking about, paths to parenthood, and known sperm donation, certainly one of those. But it isn't one that we're taught about in school, or there's a lot of information available about necessarily. So as you said, I'm Justine Witzke, and I am the founder, CEO of Aligneage Fertility, which is a sperm bank and fertility consultancy here in Midtown Manhattan. And I've worked in IVF in New York City for almost 20 years at this point. I was at a very large, very reputable IVF program for a long time. And we've been here at Aligneage Fertility for about 2 years. And we see a variety of patients. We see people who just need a semen analysis. They've never had testing done. We see people who are freezing sperm before cancer treatment, before gender affirming care, if they have some other medical indication for it. And then we work with a lot of people who need known donor testing and screening. And this is actually still further a few groups of patients. So anybody who's working with a gestational surrogate ultimately will be tested as a known sperm donor. So the same sort of regulations apply to that as someone who is serving as a sperm donor to a friend, a family member, someone they know. And it is, a real honor always. And I probably said this on every recorded production that I've been on, but it still genuinely feels like a privilege that people let us into this part of their lives and talk to us about things that they're not really sure even how to ask the question sometimes. So I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, no. I'm really so happy that you're on, because I know you from when you were working in a large institution in fertility, and there was so much going on there. So you really have such a depth and scope of knowledge in the field. And so known donation is something that's relatively new in the scheme of things, or at least relatively new that we're talking about and putting pieces in place to help people work through. So I'm wondering if you can give a little bit more insight and information into what exactly that means. Like, what does it mean to have a known donor?
Absolutely. Yeah. So maybe I'll take one step back. So historically, to find a sperm donor, a lot of people would go to a website, to a company, a commercial sperm bank, order vials of donor sperm, have them shipped to their fertility center, and proceed with treatment. And that works for a lot of people, and that's still a really viable option. However, it doesn't feel quite right to everyone. So a lot of people want to use someone who they know, someone who they know their family, they know their medical history, they're going to have some level of a relationship with moving forward. And the regulations and requirements in place from the FDA and the Department of Health that overarch what we do here came out in 2005. So it's been 20 years. We just passed the anniversary of it, actually, 20 years of these regulations being in place. So it isn't necessarily that it's brand new, but 20 years isn't all that long. And how many people were utilizing a friend or a family member as a sperm donor 20 years ago? A small percentage of what we see now.
Many times when they weren't talking about it. It wasn't out in the open, and we weren't talking about family structures the way we're talking about family today, which is so important, because ultimately we're bringing a child into the world who's going to be a person.
Right.
And we want everybody to feel comfortable and confident in the roles that they have in being a family.
Absolutely.
And there's so many pros and cons to both ways, right? Depending on who you were. That's what you were saying before. For some people, it's better to know the person and feel comfortable with them and have that relationship and know the medical, which you're talking about, and understand like what all those intricacies of the relationship are going to be like. And then for others, they rather not. But then you start asking questions about family limits and about number of donations that you don't know about. So It's so complex and so interesting at the same time.
With known donation in particular, the way I think about it nowadays, we can branch these things out so many ways. there are still sort of two categories, if you will, within known donation. One is a friend or family member who you have some long-lasting relationship with, right? You present to your fertility center or to us here at Aligneage Fertility, and you say, hi, we'd like to build our family this way, or I'd like to build my family this way. This is my proposed sperm donor. That's one option. There are now, and this is only in the last few years, really, what I've been calling facilitated known donors. So people who are out, there are consultants, agencies, whatever you'd like to call them, who are recruiting people who are interested in being sperm donors and interested in having a relationship with the recipients. And those recipients are then able to match with a donor who they get to meet. They get to build whatever level of relationship they all feel comfortable with. And presumably they'll have access to this donor's medical information, health information of the family throughout the child's life. And with the agreements that these donors are making with the agency, there are pretty tight family limits that they're agreeing to. And there's a genuine relationship among these people. So it isn't something where the donor is going to be like, oh, I'll just sign it and say yes, and then do something different. Like they have a real relationship with each other. And for a lot of people, they liked the idea of known donation, but they didn't have a brother-in-law or a high school friend to use as a sperm donor. So this gives a whole new potential group of donors.
Are they doing this with egg donation too? I believe they are.
I think there's definitely egg donation has led the way for a lot of these things. And only recently has sperm donation kind of gotten this option available. And one of the things with, this maybe jumps a little far forward with the regulatory pieces of it, but in testing and screening of donors, there are several steps. I'm sure we'll get to that as we talk about this. But ultimately, us as the tissue bank, we have to make what's called a donor eligibility determination. So we have to say this donor is eligible, this donor is ineligible. And there are lots of things that make a donor ineligible that we don't really consider to be dangerous and we don't consider to be clinical risks for the recipients. But those ineligible donors would not have been able to proceed with a non-identified or anonymous donation. So this facilitated known donation actually increases the potential pool of donors by quite a lot to whole groups of people who would not have otherwise been able to serve as sperm donors. So that's also a really cool kind of modern take on it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Can you tell us some of the checklist and some of the things that people have to go through?
Of course, yeah. So known donor screening, let's say you call me up and you say, hi, I have this known donor, or I'm working with this known donor through this agency. First, what we want to do are two things that I usually tell people. We want to start with the least invasive, least expensive steps of this process. And those are semen analysis and genetic carrier testing. These are the things that, if there's going to be sort of a deal breaker in this process of the screening, are most likely to be the deal breaker. They also happen to be kind of the simplest tests to do. So a baseline semen analysis is a few $100s and we get the results the same day. And if the person who is your prospective donor doesn't really have semen parameters that are appropriate for your treatment plan, then maybe they aren't the perfect donor for you, right? And let's find that out first before you have a legal contract, before you pay a lot of money to screen them, before you spend a lot of time going down this path, because we know time always is a critical part in the fertility journey. And the genetic carrier screening is really important because if both the egg provider and the sperm provider are carriers of the same recessive disorder, then there's a 25% chance a baby could be affected with that disorder. And in some people, they want to proceed and they'll do genetic testing of the embryos. But in many cases, that's an appropriate time to kind of pivot and maybe change sperm sources. So we like to know those things first. Then usually we will tell the group, maybe this is a same-sex female couple, maybe it's a single mom by choice, maybe it's a heterosexual couple where there's no sperm available, whatever the arrangement is, we will tell them usually to meet with a mental health professional. Maybe their clinic will require this. Maybe their clinic will recommend it. Maybe they have in-house mental health services. Maybe it's something that is done outside. But that's usually a 3-part process. Usually the donor and maybe the donor's partner would be involved. The recipient and the recipient's partner, if there's a partner, would be involved. And then a group meeting so that everybody's sort of moving in the same direction, has similar expectations of what the relationship might look like in the future and, what this process entails.
I think I'm going to interrupt you just for a second.
Please. Yeah, this is your area of expertise.
I can't underscore that one enough. Not just because it's my area of expertise and you're so familiar with it, but also because just like the medical is so important to find out about the physical health, we want to find out about the mental health and the environment that, you're going to be building your family with and making sure that everybody's on the same page. And there's so many family structures today, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can have both people, the donor could have a husband or a wife, and the recipient can have a husband or a wife. And so you need all four people then to be on the same page and comfortable in the process. Because when this child is born, you want them to feel welcome and you want them to feel wanted, and they will be. And, it's a beautiful scenario. We want to be sure, though, that each person that's involved is comfortable in their role and comfortable in the future they see. And many times we don't look to the future and we don't look at basic scenarios where, you may not want to be considered a parent, but does that mean, somebody has to run out in the middle of the night and you're very close friends, you don't get called? What does that mean? What does that look like to you? And these real life cases are so important to flesh out a little bit. Nobody's going to know the answers right away.
One of the ones that I use as an example all the time is like maybe the donor or maybe the recipient don't have a partner at the time that they're doing this, but maybe they'll have a future partner. Uh-huh. And disclosing this part of the journey and what, the outcome and what have you, and their role in it to their future partner is sometimes something people haven't really thought about. And if the donor wants to have their own children in the future, this is a half sibling to their future children. And there's a lot of layers to this. And what a family looks like is continually evolving. I think it's one of the great pieces of the work that we do. We work with individual parents, couples, 3-person family arrangements. We work with people working with sperm donors. It can look like anything. And if you want to be a parent, there's a way to be a parent. It may not look exactly like what you had imagined when you were a child. But, I think that's one of the critical pieces of having the right conversations with the right professionals and sort of understanding what options exist for you. There will be something that feels right.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be comfortable with it. So we have the physical that you're talking about. The first 2 tests are really important.
Yeah, we do. To summarize, we'll do semen analysis. We'll do genetic carrier testing. We will refer out for the mental health piece of it. We'll refer out for legal contracts. So we want this to be very clearly elucidated in a formal way where the donor has legal representation, the recipient has legal representation, and what the expectations are laid out there, right? Everybody's protected. If the relationship were to change among the group in the future, there is no question of what the intention was with the donation. So that's an important part. So if all those things are checked off and look good.
As people start to worry about parentage and responsibilities, I just actually talked to Jennifer Moss I have a recent podcast.
Oh yeah, she's great.
Oh my God, Jennifer's fabulous. I love Jennifer. She's really fabulous. She's just like a wealth of information. Mm-hmm. And she really outlines, just overarching things that we want to look at, but it's all state specific. And that's right. Everybody who's listening to this should really keep in mind that there are a lot of different laws in a lot of different states. So you need to get your legal advice from a lawyer who's within your state.
Right. Often we work with donors and recipients that are not physically located in the same state. So, speaking to the right legal experts is definitely important so that you have the most up-to-date information and you have everything sort of covered for the future. I completely agree. And Jennifer, among many of her colleagues, is a wonderful option.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I just did a podcast with her. So
that's great. That's great. So let's say all those things are done. Then we'll bring the donor in for the actual donations and the testing and screening that will meet the FDA and Department of Health requirements. That first visit for the donor, usually it's about 90 minutes to do everything. It's a pretty extensive visit. We do quite a lot of paperwork on personal and family health history, risk behaviors, travel, drug use, sex partners, all these things that put people at risk of having been exposed to an infectious disease. Because from a regulatory standpoint, the spirit of this is reduce the risk that an infectious disease could be transmitted among people who are not sexually intimate partners. So there's a lot of paperwork sort of surrounding that. We do infectious disease testing, genetic testing if it wasn't previously completed, toxicology testing, so drug testing on the donor, physical exam, and he provides a sperm sample. And that set of testing applies to any sperm samples he gives within a 7-day window. So we often will see the donor a few times over the course of a week, try to get the recipient a nice number of vials where, as they move forward with their fertility treatments, they aren't making treatment plan decisions or family planning decisions off of, oh, we might run out of sperm. I say this to people probably every single day. We want you to make a decision on like your tolerance to continue fertility treatment, not, oh, we ran out of sperm because the donor was only available one day. If the donor is only available one day, that's what we get, right? And we'll work with that and we'll try to help guide what the plan should be to most efficiently utilize that sperm. But if we're able to see the donor, let's see, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we get 3 or 4 vials each visit, that gives patients a nice amount of flexibility that if their treatment plan maybe isn't super efficient and maybe they need a few treatment cycles, or maybe they just love having babies and they need a third baby, 5 years from now, that they have the sperm available to do that. So we'll do all of that. We'll get the results back, counsel everybody, talk to them. And I should have mentioned, we also have genetic counseling available. Sometimes people do that through a clinic. Sometimes they'll do it through us, but it's always encouraged. And in many clinics, and this is something that if you Google it, you will get 25 different answers. There's a quarantine requirement. I don't know if that's come up on any of your prior podcasts, but
actually,
it hasn't.
No.
So I'll explain the quarantine. So the FDA and the Department of Health recommend that a donor is tested and screened. The sperm is frozen and held for 6 months. And the donor is retested after the 6 months for infectious diseases. The spirit of the quarantine is that if someone was exposed to an infectious disease right before the initial set of testing, it could be a false negative. By repeating it, you basically confirm that negative test. The next section of the regulation says, in a case of known donation, the recipient has the right to reduce or waive the quarantine. Then, let's call it 1.5 years, 2 years ago, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine came out with this paper that said that with the improvements in testing technologies over the last 20 years, they believe that 35 days of quarantine with retesting achieves that same goal, avoiding a false negative. So what has happened then is every clinic has their own protocol. Sometimes the recipient can waive the quarantine entirely. Sometimes it's a minimum of 35 days with retesting. Some clinics like 6 weeks, some like 3 months, some like 6 months. So part of working with a place like us is that we will help navigate that with your clinic, with the donor, with the recipient, and make sure that we're all moving in the same direction and that we have a plan of when we're going to retest the donor. Then you transport the vials to your clinic and you proceed. So I think one of the things that over the last 18 years of doing this work, so often, unfortunately, recipients of known donation would call an IVF center and say, okay, I want to work with a known donor. And they would get some sort of grunt from the person on the other end of the phone who would say, oh, there's a lot of steps to that, or some equivalent. And I think my point with all of this and with talking about it the way I do is, yes, there are a lot of steps, but it's also what we do every single day. So it doesn't feel like a lot of steps. These are the steps. So we do them, we do the next one, we do the next one. And if this feels like the sperm source that you want, it's a very feasible process, right? It's just a matter of going through it.
Yeah, no, it is a lot. I mean, I think it's all overwhelming when you're first hearing about it. It becomes less overwhelming, but it just seems like, so much information that people have a hard time taking it all in. And it's understandable when you first.
For sure.
Yeah. So my question is, when somebody wants to use a known donor, and you kind of answered it just now, they go to a clinic or a general reproductive endocrinologist typically cannot do that. Is that correct? They would typically refer to somebody who has the protocols in place and the services to do known donation.
Most of the time, that's the case. There are some IVF centers that will screen known donors in-house, right, through their own protocols. But we work with, in New York here, most of the IVF programs here, where you don't need to be a reproductive endocrinologist to screen a known donor. The known donor doesn't need a reproductive urologist. What they need is this like ultra specialized niche of clinical assessment, referrals for the other pieces of the process, and the andrology services. So what we're able to do is kind of supplement these IVF programs, not have them sort of piecing together, right? They're best utilized managing IVF treatments, managing stimulation, doing egg retrievals, making embryos, right? They're kind of functioning at the top of their scope of practice doing that. And we're then able to fulfill this educational and clinical component for the known donors.
It's wonderful. It really is a concierge service in many ways, right?
We want people to feel taken care of, right, when they come to us. And we know that this is a whole new language for most people, right? There isn't some way to learn fertility language just out in the world all that well. And right, could you get sperm just by basically shopping online and getting the sperm shipped? You could, right? For some people, that feels perfectly like what they want. For a lot of people, doesn't feel quite like what they want.
That's okay. And known, then you would want to be sure that everybody feels comfortable and confident in their decisions. It sounds like your company and companies that function as you do really provide that, and it's almost essential in a way. And so if you're using somebody who's known, then it's really important to get all these services in place.
I mean, I certainly think so, right? I've committed my career to that and all the work that I've done. And, it sounds so silly now because it wasn't by design, but my dissertation when I did my PhD was on commercial donor sperm preparation and the differences in IUI outcome. So now I seem very organized, like this was all in the plan.
It's all in the plan.
I can't say that it really was all in the plan. But I think it's something maybe by my observation, and maybe I didn't even realize it throughout my career, that it wasn't really the focus of a lot of things, right? For so many years, people were just told, oh, go buy some donor sperm, right? And why weren't we as an industry paying the same level of attention to recruiting sperm donors as we were to recruiting egg donors? Because this type of work has been done with egg donation for many, many years, right? So I think it's really just a matter of like, we're catching up the sperm donor side of things to what has been expected and is quite appropriate with egg donation for so long.
Right. No, I think it really seems necessary. Honestly, if you're going to go with somebody known, this seems very necessary. And that's, I would imagine, why all of the clinics are working with you or reaching out to you on some level, maybe not on every case, but, on many cases, because it makes sense. You want people to be able to get that screening and that information.
Absolutely. And it feels like it's been really well received by patients, by clinics, by recipients. We work with patients who maybe the recipient is local to New York, but the donor lives elsewhere, or maybe the donor is local to New York and the recipient lives elsewhere. Sometimes nobody's local to New York and they come to us here. We're so privileged to do this type of work in New York. New York has really the best expertise of our industry around the world, I would say. And this is just a fun fact, but something like 20% of the IVF cases done in the country are done within 30 miles of New York City. The vast majority of this work is being done here. And we also see, as you were talking about, all these different family structures, all these different ways of building a family, of becoming a parent. I think we need a lot of right answers to the same questions, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is fabulous. I think you gave us so much to think about and so much information to everybody listening today. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add before we end, but is there anything else you think we should mention? Because this is a lot of information, a lot of education.
As I think I started with, I could talk about this forever. There are nuances to every single case. There are nuances to every semen analysis that we do. And, we call patients same day with the results, go through what the results are, but what does that mean? Right. And I think that's really the important part. And in my view, is what our role is as fertility professionals, is to interpret that for your practical use, right? So if someone presents and say, I want to use this donor and I want to do inseminations, we need to make sure that there's going to be a reasonable amount of motile sperm after the processing, after the freezing and thawing, and that it's appropriate to use that donor for inseminations. Now, IVF, we only ultimately need 1 sperm per egg, right? So our threshold of what the parameters can look like is quite a bit different. And, that can affect who's an appropriate donor, right? And it really, it isn't just, oh, I picked this person and everything else will fall into place. Maybe that will be the case, but maybe there are things that we're really going to have to talk about, think about, work with your reproductive endocrinologist on, and kind of make a plan that feels like it is achieving your goals and kind of aligned with what you're imagining moving forward. We love doing this work, and, we really feel like it helps reproductive endocrinologists, it helps recipients, it makes donors feel taken care of in the process. And that's really the goal.
Well, I would add one more thing. I think all this preparation helps the person that's being brought into the world. And
that's a great. I'm going to use that from now on.
Please do, because we lose sight of it. And it's so easy to lose sight of when there's so much going on, that there will be a person at the end of this. And if we don't prepare ourselves, whether we're the recipient parent or the donor or the partner of one of these people or the future partner, then that's going to impact this person. And they didn't really ask for any of that. And so we need to be sure that their journey is one where they can be comfortable. But if these people are not comfortable, then that's going to make it very hard. So
right.
I love all the prep. I really do.
Yeah, I think, to that point, it's easy as a fertility patient to kind of get so focused on the steps and lose the tether to, this is a lifelong decision of the baby I'm going to have or the babies I'm going to have. And I think that's a really important piece to keep connected to, right? What's the point of all these steps is to get to those babies.
Right. And then people, as they grow up as adults, have to carry this with them. So they
won't always be babies. Oh, gosh.
Their history. Well, thank you so much for this information and this time. I love the conversation, actually. I love talking about this because there's so many different family structures today and so many ways to build families that I'm so glad that sperm donation is catching up with egg donation. I think it's an important piece. Yeah.
I really appreciate you having me. If people want to find me, it's aligneagefertility.com. Pretty easily accessible from there. If you call, I'll probably answer the phone. So we'll hopefully be able to point you in the right direction if we're not the ones to be able to help directly.
Okay, that's fantastic. And if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me at lorimetz.net.